My own son told me we were going on a healing trip after my husband passed, but I overheard their real plan to dump me in Florida with a one-way ticket and steal everything I had. They smiled to my face while they isolated me from my friends, treating me like a confused old woman they could just discard. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, and the cold public justice I delivered 6 months later was a lesson in respect they never saw coming. You know, it's funny, the little things you notice when something is wrong. I was sitting on the patio of my son Mark's house in Franklin, one of those sprawling new builds that all look vaguely alike, and all I could focus on was the sweat on the crystal glasses. It was a humid Tennessee afternoon, and the condensation was trickling down the sides, looking for all the world like tears. My son was holding court, telling some story about a golf game, and his laughter was just a little too loud, a little too frequent, like he was trying to convince himself as much as his guests. His wife Tanya stood beside him, plastered to his arm, with a smile that looked like it was carved from porcelain. She was scanning the party, but her eyes weren't warm. They were assessing, calculating. I saw them linger for a moment too long on a neighbor's brand new Lexus, and there was a flicker of something in her expression. Not admiration, but a kind of hungry resentment. It was all a performance, a grand play about wealth and happiness, and I was starting to feel like a piece of antique furniture they'd dragged onto the set for authenticity. Ever since my husband John had passed a month earlier, they'd descended on me in a whirlwind of what they called care. Tanya had insisted I couldn't possibly rattle around in my own house alone, her voice full of a syrupy sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. So they moved me into their guest suite. It was a beautiful room, I suppose, if you like living in a magazine spread all gray and beige with no pictures, no memories, no life. They told me I needed to rest to heal. But their idea of healing looked a lot like isolation. My calls were suddenly a bother. They'd handle things they said. When my old friend Carol from the church choir stopped by, Tanya met her at the door with a polite, firm dismissal, explaining that I needed absolute quiet. They were building a wall around me, one kind word at a time, and I was starting to feel less like a cherished mother and more like a well-tended hostage. The real reason for all this suffocating attention became clear the following Tuesday. Tanya sat next to me on a silk sofa that probably cost more than my first car. She had a sheaf of papers and an expression of deep, practiced concern. She told me how worried they were, how complicated Dad's affairs were, and how they'd found a way to simplify everything so I wouldn't have to worry my pretty little head about a thing. She slid a pen into my hand, telling me it was just a standard power of attorney, so Mark could handle the bills for me. Just a little signature was all it would take. I looked over at my son. He was standing by the fireplace, staring intently at a little porcelain bird on the mantelpiece, studying it as if it held the secrets to the universe. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The silence in that perfect, soulless room was so heavy, it felt like you could have cut it with a knife. All the unspoken things, all the years of trust, felt frayed and thin, but it was all I had left. So I signed. My hand was steady, but my heart felt like a cold, heavy stone in my chest. That night, sleep wouldn't come. My mind just kept turning over and over. I finally got up to get a glass of water, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, so I made no sound. As I got near the kitchen, I heard Tanya's voice. It wasn't her usual smooth, charming tone. This was a low, furious hiss, like a snake in the dark. I heard her say that it wasn't enough that the closing was in 2 weeks, and the bank had called again. She said the sale of my house wouldn't clear in time to cover something called a bridge loan, and that they were going to lose their deposit. Mark must have been on the other end of the line, mumbling his usual useless reassurances, because I heard her snarl into the phone. She told him not to you dare say it would be okay. her voice cracking with a kind of raw, terrifying desperation I had never heard before. She said there was only one last option left, the Florida plan. And it had to be now. The line went silent, but her words hung there in the darkness of that big, empty hallway, sharp and jagged as broken glass. In that moment, I understood everything. They weren't caring for me. They were liquidating me. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I woke up the next morning feeling like a woman who had walked through a fire and found herself impossibly still standing on the other side. The shock of it all hadn't broken me. It had burned away the fog of grief that had clouded my mind for weeks, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and blessedly clear view of the world. When I walked into the kitchen, Tanya and Mark greeted me with bright, false smiles. Tanya started chattering about a wonderful surprise she had for me, while Mark busied himself with the coffee maker, keeping his back to me. It was almost comical. They were such amateurs at this kind of deception. Their guilt was a clumsy, stinking cloak they didn't know how to wear properly, and I could see the frayed edges from a mile away. I took a seat at their polished granite island, the kind of thing that always looks clean but never feels warm, and began to stir my tea. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence stretch out, watching them fidget. I could see Mark's shoulders tense up, could see Tanya's smile start to twitch at the corners. Finally, I looked directly at my son, letting my voice go soft, lacing it with the innocent confusion they expected from me. I asked him as if the thought had just popped into my head about that nice man from our old bank, Mr. Henderson. I mentioned how helpful he'd always been to his father and me, and that I was thinking of giving him a call, just a friendly chat, to make sure all those papers I'd signed were in order for him. The effect was instantaneous. A spoon slipped from Mark's hand and clattered loudly against the pristine tile floor. Tanya's smile didn't just falter, it froze into a rictus of pure horror. She practically shouted that there was no need, her voice too quick, too sharp. She tried to recover with a forced little laugh, explaining that everything was handled, that they'd moved all my accounts to their bank because it was so much more efficient. As Mark scrambled to pick up the spoon, he mumbled his agreement, adding that Mr. Henderson had retired anyway. I just nodded slowly, taking a long, deliberate sip of my tea. The lie was so clumsy, so pathetic. Their stories, just like their finances, were a house of cards, and I had just gently blown on the foundation. Panic, I've learned, makes people careless. Later that morning, while Tanya was in the shower, her phone, which she'd left on the counter, started buzzing incessantly. A string of texts lit up the screen from someone named Sarah Brentwood Moms. I couldn't help but see them. It was a frantic stream of messages about a canceled catering deposit for some neighborhood block party. It was a small thing, really, but it was a loose thread. It screamed of cash flow problems. Taking a risk, I slipped back to my room and pulled out the old, forgotten iPad John had bought for me years ago. It took a moment to power up, but it connected to their Wi-Fi without a problem. I opened my email and sent a quick, carefully worded message to my oldest friend, Eleanor, a woman who had worked as a paralegal for 40 years and had a mind like a steel trap. The subject line was gardening question.
I told her I needed advice on a particularly invasive weed and asked her to call me on the iPad's number tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp, stressing that she shouldn't use my old number. I ended by saying it was a matter of some urgency. With a tap of my finger, I had planted a seed in friendly, capable soil.
After that, the atmosphere in the house grew thick with their fear. They watched my every move. My feigned frailty, which had been their tool, was now their prison. They couldn't leave me alone for a second. That evening, Tanya finally announced the big surprise. With a brittle smile stretched across her face, she told me they were taking me on a trip to Florida, a one-way trip. They had found a beautiful retirement community where I could live in the sun and be cared for. Their descriptions were glowing, their voices full of manufactured excitement. They thought they were closing the trap, but I could see the bars now clear as day. And I knew something they didn't. My John had always been a cautious man. He always told me to keep a little something back just for a rainy day. He had no idea the kind of storm that was coming. I simply smiled back at them, letting my eyes well up with what they took for grateful tears. I whispered that it sounded just lovely, utterly and completely lovely. I let them believe they had won. For the next week, I gave the performance of a lifetime. I became the docile, slightly confused old woman they needed me to be. I'd wander into a room and forget why I was there. I'd misplace my reading glasses only to have Tanya find them perched on my own head. I asked the same questions about the Florida trip, about the weather, about the flight at least twice an hour. I started to shuffle when I walked, my shoulders stooped, with a weariness that was part acting and part the genuine crushing weight of their betrayal. And just as I'd hoped, I saw the relief wash over them. Their panic from the other day subsided, replaced by a smug, arrogant confidence. They had gotten away with it. They were the smart ones, and I was just a relic from a bygone era, easily managed, easily discarded. Their condescension became my shield, the perfect cover for what I was about to do. As they bustled around me, making arrangements for my exile, they had no idea of the desperation that truly drove them. You see, about 6 months before, Tanya had been sitting in the sleek, minimalist office of a loan officer. Her hands were clenched so tight in her lap, her knuckles were white. The loan officer, a man with tired, seen-it-all eyes, slid a stack of papers across his glass desk. He told her, without a shred of sympathy, that he was sorry. He explained that her debt-to-income ratio was simply too high. Between their adjustable-rate mortgage, resetting a balloon payment on a second property, and the mountain of credit card debt, they were, in his frank assessment, insolvent. Tanya's carefully constructed socialite mask crumbled, her face pale with a terror that was ugly and real. She pleaded with him, telling him there must be something, that my husband's mother had assets. The banker just leaned back, his expression unchanging. He told her that unless she had legal control of those assets, they were completely irrelevant. Later that night, she sat in the dark of her multi-million-dollar home, her face illuminated only by the cold blue glow of her laptop screen. She was scrolling through websites for luxury elder care facilities in Florida, her expression no longer one of fear, but of a predator who had just found a solution. Back in the present, while Tanya was on the phone confirming my flight, and Mark was off at a business lunch that I knew was likely another panicked meeting with their bank, I was busy. I kept my eye on the clock, and at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the old iPad chimed softly. It was Eleanor. Her voice was the most comforting sound I had heard in weeks, a balm of pure sanity. She got right to the point, asking what this nonsense about an invasive weed was, her tone already sharp with concern. I didn't waste a second. In a low, urgent whisper, I told her everything, the power of attorney they'd tricked me into signing, the phone call I'd overheard, the sudden one-way trip to Florida. I heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end. I heard her hiss one word: vultures. Then her voice changed, becoming the calm, commanding tone of the paralegal she'd been for 40 years. She told me to listen carefully and to do exactly as she said. Following her instructions, I used the iPad to access a bank account Mark and Tanya knew nothing about. My John was always a cautious man. Years ago, he'd set up a trust, a separate little entity funded by a small inheritance from his own mother. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was my escape hatch. With Eleanor guiding me, I transferred a significant portion of the funds to a brand new account at a different bank. Then I dug to the bottom of the suitcase they had so thoughtfully packed for me. Underneath an old wool sweater, I found what I was looking for: my original will, my marriage certificate, and John's death certificate. Their arrogance had made them sloppy. They never thought to look for documents they believed were meaningless. I laid each one out on the bedspread, my hands shaking just a little, and photographed every single page with the iPad's camera. I sent the encrypted files straight to Eleanor. They were so focused on what they were taking from me, they never for a second considered what I already had. The day before my scheduled departure arrived, with a sickening sense of finality. The house was filled with a low hum of activity, Tanya bustling about with checklists and travel tags. Her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. She was dressed in a pair of expensive yoga pants, the kind women wear to advertise a lifestyle of leisure, not for any actual exercise. She was in the foyer organizing my suitcases, the ones she'd packed for my one-way trip, when the doorbell chimed. The sound cut through the artificial calm of the house like a surgeon's scalpel. Tanya opened the door, her hostess smile already in place, and then it froze. Standing on her immaculate porch was a woman who was the very definition of crisp, impeccable professionalism. It was Eleanor. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and wore an expression that could etch glass. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and carried through the cavernous foyer, a sound that did not belong in this house of whispers and lies. She announced that she was there to see Blake Henderson. She then added the words that started the earthquake: she was my legal counsel. Tanya's face went slack with a shock so profound it was almost comical. She could only stammer, asking who she was, insisting that I didn't have a lawyer. Mark appeared from his home office, his own face a mask of bewildered confusion. Eleanor didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past them as if they were pieces of furniture, her sharp eyes scanning the opulent, debt-fueled prison they had built for themselves. She called out my name, and on that cue I emerged from the guest room. I made sure my back was straight, my expression calm. I had never been more ready for anything in my life. A wave of profound relief washed over me as I thanked Eleanor for coming. We sat in the formal living room, the one they reserved for guests they wanted to impress, the irony of it thick in the air. Tanya and Mark hovered in the doorway, their arrogant control completely shattered, their faces pale and drawn. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. She opened her portfolio and laid a single official-looking document on the polished coffee table between us. She explained, her voice cutting through the silence, that it was a revocation of power of attorney freshly filed with the county court that very morning. It rescinded any and all authority Mark Henderson had over my affairs, effective immediately. A strangled gasp escaped Tanya's throat. She insisted we couldn't do that they were my family, that they were just taking care of me. Mark, white as a sheet, finally found his voice, a weak pleading sound. He asked me what this was all about, claiming they were only trying to help. That's when Eleanor delivered the killing blow. She looked directly at them, her gaze unwavering, and informed them that we were also aware of the fraudulent attempts to sell my primary residence. She then added that we were aware of the plan to relocate me to Florida against my will, which she clarified constitutes elder abandonment, a felony in the state of Tennessee. The word felony hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And that's when Tanya broke. It wasn't a theatrical performance. It was a raw, ugly sob that tore itself from her throat, a sound of absolute ruin. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect suburban wife crumbled into a million pieces, revealing the terrified, desperate woman who had been hiding underneath all along. She started shrieking that we didn't understand. The words tumbled out in a torrent of shame and fear, a confession born of pure terror. She cried about the house, the bank, about how they were going to lose everything. The parties, the cars, the private school tuition, everyone would know. They would be nothing. She confessed it all: the crushing mortgage, the maxed out credit cards, the suffocating need to maintain an image for people they didn't even like. It was a pathetic, ugly story of a life built on the sandy foundation of perception. All the while, Mark just stood there, his head in his hands, a statue of a man finally broken by the weight of his own weakness. Their pathetic little conspiracy wasn't just fractured, it was obliterated. In that moment, I stood up. The power in the room, which had been so imbalanced for so long, was now entirely mine. My voice was steady and clear when I spoke. I told them to pack my real bags. I informed them I would be staying with Eleanor. And then I told them to cancel my flight. I was no longer their victim. I was the author of their consequences, and I was just getting started. 6 months passed. 6 months of absolute, deafening silence. After leaving their house with Eleanor, I didn't look back. I moved into a lovely, modest condo that felt more like home than that cavernous marble prison ever did. I reconnected with my old friends from church, had long lunches with Carol, and slowly, piece by piece, began to feel like myself again. With Eleanor's expert guidance, I spent those months methodically untangling the legal and financial mess my son and daughter-in-law had created. We reversed the fraudulent power of attorney for good, secured my accounts, and put a stop to the sale of my house. Every step was quiet, precise, and legal. I never called them. I never sent a message. I simply let them dangle in the terrifying abyss of the unknown, a punishment I knew would be far more potent than any angry phone call or tearful confrontation. I let their imaginations and their creditors do the work for me. The final act was not going to be a private family drama. It was to be a carefully staged piece of community theater, and I had chosen the venue with care. The setting was the office of my new estate lawyer, a quiet, stately man named Mr. Davies, whose firm had been in Nashville for 3 generations. He had been a friend of my John's. I had arranged the meeting under the official guise of a final mediation to discuss the estate. When Mark and Tanya arrived, I almost didn't recognize them. They looked haggard, worn down by 6 months of sleepless nights and unrelenting stress. The strain of their impending financial ruin had etched new lines around their eyes and mouths. Their clothes were still expensive, I noticed, but they hung on them with less assurance, like costumes for a role they could no longer play. We all sat around a large, imposing mahogany table that shone under the soft office lights. Mr. Davies began, his voice calm and professional, stating that we were there to discuss the final disposition of the estate of the late John Henderson. He then nodded to me, giving me the floor. I took a steadying breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply presented the facts. My voice a quiet, even counterpoint to the memory of Tanya's frantic desperation in their kitchen 6 months prior. One by one, I laid out their sins. I spoke of the canceled sale of my home. I spoke of the fraudulent power of attorney. I spoke of the one-way ticket to Florida. With each sentence, Eleanor, who sat beside me, slid a neatly copied document across the polished table towards them. The bank statements, the legal filings, the flight confirmation. I watched their faces grow paler with each piece of paper, each undeniable fact. But the true judgment, the one that finally broke them, didn't come from me. It came from the quiet, profound disappointment radiating from Mr. Davies. He had known my husband. He had been to our home. After I finished, He was silent for a long moment, looking from Mark to Tanya. Then he shook his head slowly, a look of genuine sorrow on his face. He said softly that in all his years of practice, he had never seen such a profound breach of filial duty. That was the true punishment. It wasn't about the money. It was the utter demolition of their reputation in the eyes of a man who represented the very community, the very honor they had tried so desperately to project. Their social standing, the thing for which they had sacrificed their souls, evaporated under the fluorescent lights of that sterile office. Then, and only then, did I deliver the consequences. They were not cruel. They were merely just. My voice was clear and unwavering as I announced that I had established a new will and a new trust. Mr. Davies on cue slid the final bound documents into the center of the table. I explained that the entirety of my estate, including the future, proceeds from the sale of my home, and all other assets would be placed in a new foundation. It would be called the John and Blake Henderson Charitable Foundation. I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the last flicker of hope die in their eyes. I told them its mission would be to provide legal aid and temporary housing for elderly individuals who have been abandoned or financially exploited by their families. I looked directly at my son and then at his wife. I told them that their names were not mentioned anywhere in the document. It was over. I had not just disinherited them. I had taken the very inheritance they saw as their salvation and transformed it into a weapon against their own cruelty, a legacy that would forever stand as a monument to their betrayal. The aftermath of that day in the lawyer's office was a study in contrasts. For Mark and Tanya, the fall was every bit as swift and brutal as they had feared. The bank, which had been holding on by a thread, waiting for my inheritance to materialize, foreclosed on the Franklin house. The gleaming Lexus was quietly repossessed in the dead of night. I heard they moved into a cramped rental apartment on the other side of town, a place with thin walls and no social standing, the equivalent of being cast into exile in the world they had tried so hard to conquer. News of their disgrace spread through the Brentwood mom networks and the Franklin church prayer circles with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a southern wildfire. They weren't confronted with angry calls or public accusations. They were simply erased. Invitations to parties stopped coming. Calls went unreturned. Their friends suddenly became very, very busy. They had feared a social death above all else, and that is precisely what they got. Their punishment was to be forced to live an authentic life stripped of all the pretense and performance, and from what I gathered, they found it unbearable. From there, their paths diverged. Tanya, unable to cope with the loss of her status, grew bitter and resentful. She blamed Mark for his weakness. She blamed me for my cruelty. She blamed the banks, the neighbors, the world, everyone but herself. The sharp edge she once used as a weapon was now just the sad, impotent shield of a deeply unhappy woman. Mark, however, was a different story. Stripped of his wife's ambition and his own financial cowardice, he began a slow, painful journey towards something resembling accountability. He got a simple job managing a hardware store, and he started paying down their mountain of debt, one small paycheck at a time. About a year after that day, I received a single handwritten letter from him. It didn't ask for forgiveness or money. It didn't make excuses. It simply said that he was sorry and that I had deserved better. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. My new reality, on the other hand, was one of quiet, authentic peace. The Henderson Foundation became my life's purpose. I sat on the board, and with the help of a wonderful director, we began our work. I would spend my afternoons reviewing cases my own story, giving me a unique and profound empathy for the people we were trying to help. In their stories, I saw the same patterns of greed, fear, and desperation that I had witnessed in my own children. I reconnected with my community not as a poor, grieving widow, but as a woman of substance and strength. My friendships deepened, built now on a foundation of mutual respect, not familial obligation. I had lost a son, it was true, but in the process I had finally truly found myself. I'm thinking about all of this now, a little over a year later. I'm sitting on a park bench, the warm Tennessee sun on my face, watching a young family laugh as they push their daughter on a swing. It's a beautiful, ordinary day. My phone buzzes in my purse. It's an email from the foundation's director giving me an update on a new case we've taken on an old man whose children had left him at a bus station with a bag and $50. There is work to be done. There is purpose. The email has a picture of the man attached, and as I look at his tired but hopeful face, I don't feel sorrow or anger or even pity. I feel a deep, abiding sense of peace. I had not sought revenge. I had sought justice. And in doing so, I had transformed the pain of my own story into a legacy of hope for others. The one-way ticket they had bought for me had in the end taken me exactly where I needed to go home. In the end, Blake's journey teaches a powerful lesson. It reveals that the most painful betrayals often spring not from simple malice, but from the quiet desperation of people terrified of failure. Her story shows that true justice isn't about loud, angry revenge, but about the quiet strength it takes to set unbreakable boundaries. One can understand the fear that drives a person to cruelty without ever having to accept the cruelty itself. Her greatest victory wasn't just in reclaiming what was hers, but in transforming her own pain into a shield to protect others.